citizen.
Out of many
we are world citizens, same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voice.
Welcome to a very special episode of the People Powered Planet podcast. And today we have on our podcast an extra special guest, as well as two surprises coming up for you. One of the very special surprises is a surprise guest you'll get to see as the program develops, and another a special presentation. But to begin it, let me first say that our guest today is a true Earth hero, literally an Earth hero. Nick Meyer directed both the Star Trek movies as well as the incredible, both the visionary tales, the Star Trek movies, and the cautionary tale, The Day After. And during this program, we're going to find out how both of those have profoundly changed the world, and how movies can actually be a key, movies and art can be a key to saving and transforming our planet. And to start it off with this interview with this amazing Earth hero, now Nicholas, has been the author of so many books, from the 7% Solution to a range of films about Sherlock Holmes and Sigmund Freud, stories, films, screenplays. But of course, the two most well-known are Star Trek and The Day After, which had the largest TV audience of any made-for-movie before or since, and profound impact on our society. So to start off our program, we want to tell the story of Nicholas. Now in Hollywood, there's a way that there's a common formula that's used for telling stories. It's the formula that was used through the eons, and it follows what they call the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell coined the term, and it generally sets off with the heroes in his ordinary world. He has some call to an adventure. He refuses the call. He meets his mentors. He crosses the threshold. He gets tests and allies, and deals with tougher and tougher enemies. Goes through the ordeal. Well, Nicholas is just one such person, and I think we're going to start off by talking about how, and he talks about this very beautifully in his wonderful book. It's the View from the Bridge. And in his book, he says that when he first got the call to make a movie about the pointy-eared fellows, he refused the call. Tell us about that, Nicholas.
Well, I didn't exactly refuse. It's more involved than that, but basically, a mutual friend who was an executive at Paramount Pictures urged me to sit down and meet with Harve Bennett, who was going to produce the second Star Trek movie, and I had never really paid much attention to Star Trek. I think it's fair to say that I missed everything that was important about the show. Its interracial cast, its optimistic view that human beings of whatever persuasion working together could accomplish something. That all went right by me. I just saw a guy with pointy ears, and they were all walking around in Dr. Denton's, and I just kept going. But then I met Harve Bennett, who's no longer with us, and he showed me some of the movies and or the television shows and the first movie, and I began to realize that this all reminded me of something that I did like, which was the Captain Horatio Hornblower novels by C.S. Forester that I had enjoyed when I was about 12 or 13, about a Royal Naval captain in the Napoleonic Wars, and he had a girl in every port, and that sounded kind of cool. And I thought, well, this is Hornblower in outer space, and that made a kind of sense to me. And soon I was jonesing to do a space opera, and it was all about, for me, submarines or destroyers or those kind of shows, movies. And only latterly did I begin to understand, because I assure you, I'm the last person to understand anything. I know everything, but I don't understand much. So it took me a long time to understand what was remarkable about the Star Trek idea, and to sort of get behind it. I sort of learned by doing, but that's how I became involved.
Yes, well, and in your book, you mentioned that it was a kind of a pop allegory for taking these crucial issues of the day, like ecology and war and racism, and putting them into a sci-fi setting where we could deal with the human questions in a refreshingly in a refreshingly different atmosphere of outer space, looking at it from a few light years away.
Yeah, yeah. I think that science fiction, I think, typically is inevitably a reflection of things that are going on at the time when it is created. All art is ineluctably products of the time in which created. Mozart doesn't just sound inimitably like Mozart. He also sounds like late 18th century Middle European music. Renoir doesn't just look like Renoir, he looks like 19th century French Impressionism. And you can extrapolate from this. And science fiction is also a reflection of the time and circumstances in which it was created, whatever it is. And Star Trek, I think, is inevitably a kind of Cold War product back in the 60s. And this was, sort of flying in the face of the terror that we all lived under, whether we acknowledged that we were living under it or not. Since 1945, human beings have been confronted by the most terrible and unique problem they've ever faced, which is our ability to destroy ourselves. Understandably, nobody wants to think about this. In the words of George Bush II, go shopping. That's like better. But that doesn't mean it isn't there. That doesn't mean the sword isn't hanging over us. But we don't want to think about it. So Star Trek was a way of trying to help you think about it in a non-confrontational way that says, yes, people of goodwill could come together and fix things.
Well, so you were key in both directing Star Trek 2, 2, 4, and 6 you were involved in. 4 as the writer, and
well, I wrote most of 2 and I co-wrote 6.
Right, and so and then 4 you wrote, correctly?
Yes, my comedy.
Right. Well, and so both those all do exactly what you've been mentioning. So since we're talking about living under that nuclear sword of Damocles, let's jump first to 6, where essentially this was an allegory. Tell us briefly about the allegory that Star Trek 6 represented.
I had made a bad movie about the wall in Berlin. I guess it was my fault. Anyway, I was licking my wounds on Cape Cod, and Leonard Nimoy came to visit and said Paramount would like to do another Star Trek movie with the original cast. One more squeeze of the turnip. You have any ideas? And I said, no, because I never have ideas. And he said, well, the Klingons have always been our stand-ins for the Russians. And I said, they were? He said, yeah. He said, what happens if the wall comes down in outer space? Who am I if I have no enemy to define me? And I said, oh, stop. That was all I needed. We start with an intergalactic Chernobyl. The Klingon Empire is going to have to be diffused into the illegal alien trash of the galaxy. There's going to be a lot of people coming over a non-existent wall. Kirk is assigned to take the Klingon chancellor to a peace conference. We called him Gorkon, which is as close as we could get to Gorbachev, I suppose. Kirk hates Klingons. They killed his son. He bungles his assignment. The chancellor is assassinated. Kirk takes the blame. There's a show trial. They're banished to a gulag. There's an escape from the gulag. I spiel the whole thing out in 2 seconds. And basically, it became this, as you say, allegory, but it was really also about people who thought that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had reached what Francis Fukuyama at Harvard called, are we at the end of history? And Kirk says, people can be very frightened of change. The movie is a little smug on reviewing it because the end of history not only didn't happen, as Fukuyama suggested, but things have gotten steadily worse. Anyway, that was sort of what we thought we were doing. And by the way, last thing, we actually filmed the Soviet coup that toppled Gorbachev before it happened. We were in the cutting room when Gorbachev disappeared, and nobody knew whether this poor man was alive or dead. And by the way, when you're making a movie, all you think about is what's good or bad for the movie. And I am ashamed to report that we did not spend a lot of time worrying about Mr. Gorbachev, but only said, how fast can we finish the movie, because we got there first.
Well, and you also got there first on another thing, which is you in Star Trek VI, you showed the forces that were so afraid of this change, of the enemy disappearing, that they actually sought to sabotage it. They made it look like that the enemy had. You see the movie, so you can see how the sabotage occurred. Well, in the real world, exactly that happened, which is Gorbachev was very interested, even after he was out of power, in trying to bring together, creating a shift in the world where instead we would be coming together and developing a way to sanely run our planet. He was all for developing ways that we could govern the planet together in a reasonable sense. And the military-industrial complex, all these other forces that were frightened of peace. I mean, my gosh, it was the economy would tumble. There was exactly the same fears that happened in your movie, and they did indeed sabotage that from being the great leap forward it could have been for humanity. Don't you think in many ways that is, again, life imitating art?
Well, I think life and art are sort of inextricably intertwined, since the first caveman printed his handprint on the side of the wall, and then another guy came along and said, that stinks. I wonder about, and maybe your subsequent guest will have things to say about this, is whether mutually assured destruction, where two nations are presumably eyeball to eyeball with their fingers on the nuclear buttons, isn't preferable to what we've got now, because at least that supposes that this weaponry is under some kind of grown-up control. It may not be, but it's not a whole bunch of guys running around with nuclear weapons in suitcases and nobody's in control. And when Star Trek VI ends, we assume that this better world, this end of history is coming. And that's not what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yes, well, I think we will get to that with our next guest. But before that, let me move briefly to, well, all of your films are amazing, but let's go to Star Trek IV, which is an incredible allegory for the other major problem facing our planet, and that is the threat of extinction. Tell us a little bit more about Star Trek IV and how it handled that issue.
It's a comedy about extinction, and I felt that if Louis Malle could make a comedy about incest, we could probably make a comedy about extinction. It's the one about the whales, as everybody knows, and about a time travel episode in order to save a pair of breeding whales, Noah's Ark type, into the 23rd century so that they would not be extinct. And it's basically a story with a lot about 23rd century people going back into San Francisco in the 20th century and being fish, if you like, out of water. And I got to be funny, which is something how I fancy myself.
Mhm. Well, I think the key thing, both it was funny, but it also was so telling, because here in that future, the whales had already gone extinct. And that very extinction of the whales was threatening the very existence of our planet. I mean, human life on Earth was about to end unless these time travelers could go back, find a mating pair, bring them back into the future, and repopulate the species of whales. Now, you can find out more about why that threat happened when you watch the movie, if you haven't seen it yet. But I think that was a key allegory for exactly what we're facing at this time. As we move toward the dual ways of extinguishing ourselves, nuclear war and the ecocide, as well as a number of others, but those key ones, again, you've kind of put your finger on something that was a huge crossover film. It got not only the people interested in Star Trek, but so many of the people who are concerned about the fate of our world.
Just for the record, I did not make up this story. This story was concocted by Leonard Nimoy and Harve Bennett. I did wind up writing the bulk of the screenplay, all the San Francisco stuff, but it was their idea, and they had to tell it to me.
Well, thank you to them and to the whole team. One of the key points you make is that making movies is always an incredible team effort, and very fascinating to read your memoirs. I recommend it to everyone to hear more about, well, both what you went through from as a young person on your hero's journey to try to break into the industry, some incredible stories, but also what happened with your first novel, your dad being a psychoanalyst, and the 7% solution, and then time after time, really almost running to the same path as Star Trek 4, in that in both cases, time travelers have to move to another time and suddenly find some major,
And I asked them, I said, when they told me the story of Star Trek 4, and I said, do they have to go to San Francisco? I already did time travel in San Francisco. Can't they go to Paris? Can't we go someplace else? And something about the whales wouldn't fit in the Seine or something. I don't remember that, but it just like thought, no, yeah. And I wound up taking things that I had to cut out of Time After Time and putting them into Star Trek 4 because I had screwed them up, or for some reason they didn't work before.
Well, that was one of the very fun parts of watching both movies. Again, highly recommend them. And I think that, it's absolutely key that we use these allegories to take us forward. And that's where I want to go to the second stage in your hero's journey, as I see it, as really truly being an Earth hero. And that is that in addition to movies that inspire, that give us a vision of a world where there are kind of rational human beings in the future solving these problems, it's kind of like the Enterprise kind of travels through the universe. It's almost like peace engineers. How can we solve this problem or that problem? Well, one of the problems they often encounter as they were traveling through space is, threats to the very existence of planets, ways that planets could be destroyed, whole planets. Well, I think in your next stage, you had the opportunity to take on a very real planetary adventure, and that was an adventure toward saving a planet we call Earth, our little planet that we all live on. And in fact, I think what we're going to tell you with our next guest is that we're going to show that when you got the call from ABC to do the day after, there was literally a threat to the continued existence of the planet at that time. And to help us introduce this section, I'm going to introduce a very, very special guest who's with us today, a person who is key in understanding that nuclear strategy and what was happening. And that is Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg, who is very well known for having released the Pentagon Papers, having had incredible courage, and all the newspapers actually had courage in those days to simultaneously release these papers left and right so the administration couldn't stop them, and got out the word to the public about the incredible nuclear posture that was heading us toward destruction. And one of the key things that was happening at that time, as Daniel, I want to ask Daniel about. Daniel, welcome to our program.
Very glad to be here. Thank you.
Daniel, this is very special to have you here talking with Nicholas. We spoke a little with each other before the show, and you share so many things in common to carry on and talk about later. But the key thing I want to ask now is that when Nick, in his book, he mentions that when you received the call from ABC to ask you if you would do the day after, your first reaction was, my gosh, who wants to think about nuclear war and immerse themselves in that? I want to bring Dan on now to tell us a little bit about what was actually happening at that time, and particularly what role was played in Lieutenant General Danny Graham, who was Reagan's key advisor, recommending a project which he called the Strategic Defense Initiative. The press labeled it Star Wars. Tell us what that is and what that really portends about what the fate of our planet was at that time.
Well, the Strategic Defense Initiative was a hoax, actually, a large con, which was intended as an answer to the largest anti-nuclear movement the world had probably ever seen, the Freeze movement, which had a very large proportion of the people, something like 87%, higher than is imaginable in our politics, saying that there should be a cutoff of the production of new nuclear weapons or design of new nuclear weapons, that Russia and the US should have a bilateral nuclear weapons freeze as a beginning point to disarmament, that there should be no new ones. Now, that was totally unacceptable to the Reagan administration because they were making new weapons as we are now, and wanted to continue with those even at the cost of new Soviet weapons, again, as now. And better that they continue to build up so long as we build more and better. And so long as our military industrial complex gets the profits and the politicians get the donations and everything else. So they didn't want an end to it any more than they do now. Now we have both parties in Congress vying to add money to the defense budget that the Pentagon hasn't even asked for on a budget that has never been seen so high.
So briefly,
yes, go ahead.
Particularly on SDI.
Yes, well, no, on SDI, the idea was that it was anti-ballistic missile capabilities, which would supposedly neutralize the enemy's intercontinental ballistic missiles. It would hit them in the air. It would destroy them before they arrived, and be, in effect, an umbrella that would protect us while we attacked them. Now, that was infeasible then, and it's infeasible now. It was clearly infeasible.
What is Iron Dome?
Iron Dome is related to medium range or short range missiles, and that is not infeasible. That is more feasible. The speeds are less, the height is less, and so forth. And yes, it is possible to destroy medium range or short range missiles in the air, not with any guarantee, but considerably. With
Right.
ICBMs,
Right.
essentially not. It's a simple hoax on which you can
But
spend any
wasn't
amount
that-
of money. You can spend
Right.
any amount of trillions of dollars on it.
But wasn't that also predicated on the idea that it could only work if the US struck first, so that there were only
Well,
a few remaining?
No, actually, that's a slightly more esoteric point, which is even more ominous. It wasn't made generally. It was sold to the Americans on the idea that if the Russians attack us, this will protect us. That was totally infeasible. For one thing, the Russians could put so many decoys on their ICBMs as we could, that it would be impossible to check the sky which fly in outer space held the warhead, as opposed to these decoys. So, however, it was not totally infeasible to think that if we struck first and destroyed most of their weapons, certainly not all of them, we couldn't do that, that and this could be applied to China in theory, that there would be a smaller number of weapons then coming at us, and not in one salvo. Having been hit, it would be a ragged thing. We'd have more, one coming this moment, another one coming that moment, not coordinated. And in that case, there was some possibility of actually diminishing the number of warheads that would reach this country. So if we struck first, an ABM system could help limit damage. If they struck first with so many weapons and decoys, no, you couldn't have any effect. So it made it more likely that the side that had an effective ABM system would, in some circumstances, actually strike first. And
Right.
the Russians were always very concerned that we
Right.
would somehow come up with something that would actually work for us on a first strike.
So now, in that context, I want to introduce Lieutenant General Danny Graham, who was he was known as the architect of Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. He was the one that Reagan picked to be his military advisor. He was very close to and had Reagan's ear. And in my film, War Without Winners, I got to interview him. And here's what Lieutenant General Danny Graham was telling President Reagan about nuclear war.
If we knew that a bomb was going to go off over this building in an hour, I would survive, because I would walk. I can walk 5 miles in an hour, and I would get behind something so I didn't get caught with the heat flash. The blast isn't going to hurt you out there. The radiation of the bomb from the explosion of the bomb is not going to hurt you. The only thing that can hurt you is the heat, and it comes in a quick flash of heat, and what you have to do is be shaded. That's all. Just as if you were trying to hide from the rays of the sun, you get behind something that shades you. Had enough brains to walk for an hour and get behind a lilac bush, we wouldn't be hurt by that nuclear weapon.
Wow. So this is the man who, and among other generals, who were not only urging President Reagan to move toward being able to strike first and fight and win a nuclear war, but they were actually egging him on. In that context, let me turn to Nick Meyer and ask you, in that context of that possibility of striking first, what struck Reagan?
If you're referring to having seen my movie, that's what we're talking about?
Yes, I mean, here his generals were telling him, hey, you can get behind a lilac bush. Literally, this is the guy who was heading his chief advisor on this.
His ignorance, as the great Milton said, almost subdues my patience. When he met Dr. Helen Caldecott in the White House, she was the anti-nuke Australian activist. He told her that the missiles could always be recalled, and was very surprised to learn from her that they could not be recalled. So that was sort of his state of nuclear sophistication. My experience in directing the movie the day after, by the way, I was the third director, I think, to be asked to do this. Nobody in his right mind wanted to do it. So that's how it came to me. And when I was working on the film, I thought, oh, maybe this could unseat Ronald Reagan. And then I learned that the movie had done something more peculiar than that. It had changed his mind about a winnable nuclear war. And I learned this in several ways. One was in his memoir, where he basically talks about in his diary how upset he was when he saw the movie. It also was confirmed by his biographer, Edmund Morris, who had previously won the Pulitzer Prize for his life of Theodore Roosevelt, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. His biography of Reagan is a little strange. It's called Dutch. And it's strange because he inserted himself, Morris, as a fictitious character in the biography, which was meant to be a history. Nonetheless, he lived in the White House for 3 years, and he was privy to a lot of stuff. And he said the only time he saw Reagan flip out and become agitated and upset and depressed was after he saw The Day After. Now, one of the things that I've learned is that movies can help people imagine things that they otherwise can't or don't wish to imagine. And I think before Reagan saw the movie, he was incapable and unwilling, as the rest of us are, to think about, much less imagine, what a nuclear strike looks like, what the missiles leaving looks like, what the missiles arriving look like. And so he was very worried about the movie before he saw it, and went to the Pentagon, sent David Gergen, his press secretary, to screen the movie for the Joint Chiefs and discuss how are we going to counter this movie. And they decided basically to put the Secretary of State, which was George Shultz, on television with Ted Koppel to assure the country that, you know, everything was going to be okay. But that was before he actually saw the movie. And when he saw the movie, and there was also a general on Castro's staff who said that the Cuban Missile Crisis had not been real to him until he saw the movie, one picture being worth many thousands of words. The sight of the missiles leaving their silos, the sight of people being incinerated in, as the Bible would call it, the twinkling of an eye. This all made real to people things that we couldn't bring ourselves to imagine, couldn't begin to visualize. And so, yes, it did change his mind about a winnable nuclear war, and eventually sent him to Reykjavik to discuss the intermediate missile range treaty with Gorbachev.
So here's the key thing that happened. On the one hand, you know, you've answered two calls of adventure. When you were given the call to make The Day After, you also, as I understand, refused the call. How could I even do this? And there was a key incident that moved you forward to actually taking it on. Something you share here with Dan Ellsberg. Do you want to tell us for a moment about that?
I was being psychoanalyzed at the time. This is where you lie on a couch and say whatever comes into your head. And I was lying on the couch and trying to rationalize my way out of directing a movie about nuclear war. And I had some ammunition. In those days, if you directed feature films, and I had now done 2 that were successful, going to television was considered a step down, as sort of being beneath you. And I was rehearsing a lot of these excuses when my shrink, who never spoke, opened his mouth and said, "Well, I think this is where we find out who you really are." And that was a pretty devastating sentence to me. And I realized that as somebody who had previously marched in the streets protesting the Vietnam War in New York, who had gone to jail for a night in Iowa City protesting, I can't remember, Dow Chemical or something, that it was now time to put my work in the service of my beliefs. This was a very handy sentence, by the way, and I used it on other people that I wanted to be in The Day After movie. I remember saying to my cinematographer, Gain Rescher, who had also shot Star Trek II, who had also shot A Face in the Crowd, which is maybe the greatest American movie nobody knows. And he said, "Oh, don't ask me to do a movie about nuclear war." And I said, wait a minute. This is the one time Hollywood is going to give you a chance to put your work in the service of your beliefs, and you're going to pass and bitch at dinner parties about how bad things are? Gain, I think this is where we find out who you really are. Worked like a charm, that sentence, I might add.
Well, we did find out who you really are in both cases. And that is that on the one hand, You have given us the most powerful cautionary tale that not only shifted President Reagan's mind, not only did 100 million people see it in the US, which transformed viewers into activists. If you watched a wonderful new documentary called Television Event, in which Nicholas is kind of the star, and our good friend Jeff Daniels is the producer of it. If you watch that film, you will really see the incredible impact that film also had on an entire society. You'll see how the people there in Kansas who were part of it had their lives transformed, and how that film turned viewers into activists. But that happened not only in the United States. Not only did 100 million people see it in the US, more than any other made-for-TV movie before or since, but it also reached 200 million in the Soviet Union. And I firmly believe that 200 million people in the Soviet Union seeing that vivid look at what nuclear war would do to society played a key role in the shift to glasnost, in the Soviet crumbling, Soviet empire crumbling. Because, I mean, who wanted to fight and win a nuclear war? In our film, War Without Winners, you see ordinary people on the street in the Soviet Union. Haskell Wexler traveled there talking to them, and people didn't want nuclear war, didn't want to think about it, just like here. So the people have always kind of had the same interest, but you have been an Earth hero in both providing us with a major cautionary tale, the major cautionary tale that transformed the world, and the major visionary tale, which also has transformed the world. I meet so many people who were moved by Star Trek. I mean, heck, the entire US space program, all the people running it said they were moved by Star Trek, right?
Well, a lot of people who work for NASA certainly got their start being Star Trek aficionados. But I would just like to throw a little cold water on all of this. First of all, while there have been movies such as The Day After or Star Trek, which could be said to have had positive influences on many people and encouraging optimistic philosophies and optimistic actions and positive actions, there are also movies that do the exact opposite. You know, John Milius made Red Dawn in response to The Day After. And in a post-literate world, people get a lot of their information from movies. People who saw The Deer Hunter believed that the North Vietnamese made American POWs play Russian roulette. I don't believe there's any evidence that ever happened, but a lot of people watching that movie, and it's a movie that got a lot of awards and it's a very well-made film, may come away with that this is history. And you know, when you read a biography, one can assume that an effort has been made to determine the truth and the facts. When you read a novel, you understand that liberties and dramatic license have been taken. You can call it a historical novel, but you're adding, you're subtracting, you're rearranging. And movies do that all the time. But I don't think in a country that has completely done away with public education, completely trashed public education, there's anybody left to discern the difference between movies as propaganda, movies as misinformation, conspiracy theories on the internet, and whatever it was that The Day After and Star Trek managed to do sort of on the other side. It's not the most optimistic response.
Well, we are so grateful that in that vast kind of cesspool of movies misinforming us and the whole mass culture sending us in the wrong direction, we do have a startling example in you as a person who has been instrumental in I think the most powerful cautionary and the most powerful visionary tale that has reached humanity. And in honor of that, we have another special surprise for our audience here. It's already been sent to you. I believe that David Gallup here who is the head of the World Citizen Government in Washington, D.C., started by Gary Davis, our mentor of the program, who envisioned a people-powered planet in the future. I believe you have with you, Nick, the world passport that he sent to you. Yes, okay. David Gallup, in honor of Nick truly being an Earth hero who has actually made films that have literally saved the world. I mean, I think it's quite literally possible that none of us would be here today if Lieutenant General Danny Graham had continued to be able to convince Reagan to be on that path of war fighting, that we had to destroy them first or they would get us. I think we're all grateful to you for truly being an Earth hero. And so with that, I'm going to turn it for a few moments over to David to officially present you with your honorary world passport, something that's been presented to Nobel Prize winners, to Nelson Mandela, to other Gandhi. In fact, when Gary personally presented it to Gandhi, to Nehru, Nehru said, "This is the passport Gandhi would have carried." David, can you give the formal presentation?
Yes. Well, Nicholas, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your heartfelt sentiment about the power of movies, and in honor of your service to humanity by using the power of movies to avert a nuclear war and to inspire us to a multicultural world. We are honored to offer you the honorary world passport, which helps you to understand that you are a world citizen and then you have rights and duties to the planet and to all humans. Thank you for that. And having watched the documentary television event, I also want to say how impressed I was by your not taking no for an answer from the television executives. That is not compromising on what you wanted to see in the day after. And that so much reminds me of Gary Davis, his unwillingness to take no from, whether it was from border guards or government officials, in demanding that his fundamental rights be respected as a world citizen. So thank you from all the world citizens for your lifetime of work. We appreciate you.
Thank you very much. I think reports of my heroism are probably a bit exaggerated compared to anybody else that you've mentioned here, and some people that you haven't. I'd like to think of myself as a hero, but I haven't quite worked up to it. Anyway, thank you very much for my passport.
Can you show us your passport and also the page with the title page inside?
Here's the passport. And it looks just like Gandhi's, except the photo. And there's a lot of detailed information.
Well,
I'll proudly carry this passport.
excellent, excellent. Well, as Gary said when he presented an honorary world passport to Patrick Stewart and to LeVar Burton and to a few key members of the Star Trek crew back then, don't leave the planet without it. Okay, well, thank you so much. Now, with that, we are going to open the questions with moving to another very special hero, someone who, again, actually shared a common experience with you. We're going to turn it over a minute to Dan Ellsberg, who I
think he's more in the genuine hero category.
Well, I do believe that moving our culture is so crucial in changing the world. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Dan to both briefly share what he shared in common with you and that little story you told about there's where we find out who you are, and then ask you a question. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, well, let me say very freely, Nicholas, that having just re-seen The Day After and reading your memoir about the making of it last night, you have become a hero of mine, no question. And in fact, I could easily imagine the team of which you were a major part that persisted in pressing this movie along in the concept that you had of it as getting an earning and actually getting a Nobel Peace Prize. It was an event that actually did result in the first and only rollback, not freeze, but actual destruction of some nuclear weapons. And the weapons that they destroyed, the SS-20s on the Russian side, the Pershing II, which was minutes away, the most accurate missile in the world, minutes away from Moscow, actually. And it's the most dangerous, unstabilizing weapon in the world at that time. And you played a major role in getting Gorbachev and Reagan to eliminate those weapons and make the world safer. Now that treaty that it led to has been rescinded
By the
Trump.
pussy grabber in chief.
That's right, by Trump and Putin, and Biden has continued that. And by the way, could easily have simply moved toward returning to it. So the effects of the day after were not long-term, but they actually were medium-term for decades, made a real difference, very, very unusually. And for that to happen and for your movie to achieve it, and I might say, having seen the movie now, I now conceive, I think nothing other than a movie could have affected minds, and specifically of Reagan, in the way that it did. Nothing else, no speech, no self-immolation, whatever. It really shows the power. So that leads to to a question. What we need now in the way of changing attitudes and behavior in Congress and in the administrations of both sides and in the alliances is a miracle. Something that I can't foresee, actually, any way going on that can happen. It has to happen in a way that something has to happen that looks impossible. And what's so striking about the process of your movie is how many people involved in it very reasonably thought it wasn't unlikely to see it funded and made and put on a screen. They thought, and these were very intelligent people, experienced it was impossible. It was impossible. But it did happen. That's the definition of a miracle. And it even had the effects that would have been regarded as impossible. Well, that's the kind of thing we need now, and pretty much in the same line. So the question to you is, how could we participate in a miracle like that now? And specifically, looking at this channel of movies, which have revealed to me now as the way to do it, what would it take? How could we help bring it about that a miracle like the day after could occur again right now? And even specifically, one subtopic there would be, could the day after, which remains entirely relevant, the current events in the Ukraine, the parties in many ways have changed parts, but the situation, the play is almost the same. And the risks are the same as they were in 1983 and 1962 and 1961. That hasn't changed. So could we get the day after shown with the promotion that it had then, getting the enormous, that would be very difficult, impossible.
Well,
Maybe not impossible.
This is a question of enormous complexity, and the answer has to be complex as well. In fact, I have been besieged over many years, mainly by scientists who keep saying to me, how can we get the day after out there? How can we remake the day after? How can we get people to watch the film? And specifically, how could we get Donald Trump to watch the movie and so forth? And the answer is I'm afraid, long-winded. One is, we've tried for many years, myself and my producing partner, Frank Spotnitz, with whom I did the Medici Masters of Florence, and we've got other things together. We went to all the streaming services who showed not very much interest in making a movie about nuclear war where everybody dies. It is about the same amount of interest that ABC exhibited when the movie was proposed over there. That movie, it should be understood, was the brainchild of the head of ABC Circle Films, a man named Brandon Stoddard. It was not my idea, not by a long shot. And everybody at the network hated this movie. And they knew, rather presciently, I knew, that there would be no sponsors. And network television is a commercial. It is in this business of selling, making money like all companies. It is a business of getting subscriptions, selling advertising, and so forth. The Day After was good for none of that. So getting the movie remade or redistributed, or imagining that a narcissistic moron like Donald Trump is going to watch a movie about anything except himself is absurd. This is what we're sort of up against. On the other hand, the movie is available. It's available on DVD, in Blu-ray, in foreign theatrical formats. I believe it's also available probably piecemeal on YouTube and so forth. It's not hard to find the movie. The reason, by the way, that it is the most watched movie ever made for TV, whose record will never be broken, is that there's too many channels. So that when there were only 3 networks, it was not hard to have everybody glued to this film. The last thing I would submit is that it was the furious opposition to the movie that gave it the publicity
That you can get again.
must-see viewing. You know, there's nothing like being banned in Boston, which is sort of did us a power of good. Thank God for Bill Buckley and Phyllis Schlafly running up and down like Chicken Little saying that the sky is falling. Anyway, that I would love to redo the film on a global version, and Frank Spotnitz and I presented that. But so far, there have not been a flood of takers.
Well, Jeff Daniels wished he could be with us, but he's in Australia where it's 3 a.m. So I think he's probably not with us. If Melanie can correct me if I'm wrong. But I do want to say that one thing we can do right now is to widely get out the film Television Event. While that's not The Day After, it is a brand new documentary that features Nick and shows the power of the day after. And it's almost like a day after light. People who are like too scared to watch the whole day after can watch Television Event and see that power and catch the drift of what that threat of nuclear war is, and perhaps ease them into then watching. There is one version on YouTube that's full. There's a lot of traps on YouTube where they're kind of phony links. But that is so it's so important, like you said, to try to get that film seen again widely, and probably not through a network anymore. But maybe there are ways that people could press a streaming service to now pick that up. Maybe someone afterwards will organize a campaign here where we get them to pay attention to that. I mean, who wouldn't want?
Full disclosure, you know, you referred to Jeff as a friend of mine. He's become a friend, but I never knew him when he decided to make this documentary. He just called me out of the blue, and I did the interviews and then forgot all about it for a year. And then people started calling me up from strange places and saying, my God, this documentary. I had a friend, a childhood friend, whose name is Dr. Stephen Piachenik. Don't ask me how you spell it, but I've known him since about 5 years old. And he became a shrink who specialized in dealing with terrorists. And he was part of the State Department. And he resigned from the State Department when Cyrus Vance admitted the Shah into the United States for medical treatment, saying you've no idea what you've done. And then, of course, came the hostage crisis, where all the Americans were taken hostage. Anyway, he resigned, but he was sort of on call. And he got a call from the David Gergen and the Pentagon to go down and watch a movie with the Joint Chiefs. And he sat with all these heads of the armed forces watching a screening of The Day After, which Reagan had not yet seen. And he said, if you wanted to draw blood there, you definitely succeeded. And and one of the things that struck me was at the end of it, they all sat there dead silent, and Gergen said, now the president wants to know what we're going to do about this movie. And Steve said, well, you know, full disclosure, this guy's a friend of mine, and he's not a communist. He likes money. So I wouldn't try to tar him as a communist. I wouldn't try to fault the movie technically, or, you know, point holes at it. We didn't mention nuclear winter and so forth. And that's when they decided to put Schultz on the on TV. But he saw one general who was clearly very disturbed. I don't remember which branch of the service he headed, but Steve said to him, the movie upset you? And he nodded shortly. And Steve said, what's the part that upset you the most? And this general said, when the missiles, it was the unimaginable imagined, which is the whole point of what movies can do. And it's why people don't want to watch those movies. It's too upsetting. It's why I don't like to watch gory movies, because it's like, it's too scary.
Well, Jeff Daniels, by the way, I got the same call when he asked me about the very tiny role I played in The Day After. I was the nuclear war researcher sending, faxing out information to your producer about the damage different distances from the epicenter so they could build the sets. But I was very pleased to meet him, and I do think that's one way we can begin to promote that documentary widely, get that out on all the streaming services, and help open the door for people seeing The Day After.
Absolutely.
With that, I do want to open it up for other people's questions. I'm very pleased that both Dan and Nicholas have said they can stay on a little bit longer. So let me turn it over to Melanie for the question period.
Thank you, Arthur. My gosh, oh my gosh, so emotional. It's so, this whole phenomenal podcast. This is perhaps the start. We're talking about how to get this out there, how do we get people to watch it. What Arthur said, we need people, we need the television event to go viral. It's a new film that'll walk people through The Day After. It's not hard. It happened. I did the same thing. I was able to watch television event, and then I wanted to watch The Day After, and the effect is incredible, and we cannot minimize the importance of this. I want everyone here, everyone listening in the future, please watch television event The Day After and send it out widely. Let's make these viral. How hard is that? I mean, we don't understand how to get things viral, but it happens all the time, and there's no reason why we can't get all the groups involved in nuclear. I can, showing it to all the countries that haven't signed the TPNW. This is totally possible. And as you see, as you've heard from Daniel, how critical it is. What's stopping us? What's stopping us? Nothing. We can do this. We can do this. We have Daniel, one person who made this huge impact. Okay, Nicholas, huge impact, and David Hartsough, huge impact. We have all these heroes I see, and we are all heroes. We can all do this. So please make this a priority. Please, this is a huge priority. And don't be stopped by, oh, I can't do it. I'm only one person. That's not true. We have examples of that. So please, that's our next priority, critical. And thank you. Thank you. So incredible to have you here, Nicholas and Daniel. David Hartsough, did you want to make a comment? Huge lifelong activist. David Hartsough, go right ahead.
Thank you, Nicholas, for making this very, very important film that I think awoke the American people and the Russian people and our presidents into the reality of nuclear war, and helped turn us around, and that we're still here. And my question is similar to Dan Ellsberg's. I think we are sleepwalking into nuclear war. We're playing nuclear chicken with both Russia and China. and the American people and the people of the world are asleep. We're totally unaware. And as was said earlier, we need a miracle similar to what this film was back in 1983. And I would hope that ABC could understand that as a contribution to the future of human life on our planet, they should show this film again, or updated version. And I wanted to ask, do we know any of the people on ABC TV? And or would I trying to develop a groundswell of encouragement and support to ABC to show it again? If not ABC, how about PBS? This
Well-
needs to be shown to millions of people in this country and around the world.
The shorter answer is I'm with you. The longer answer is that ABC, I believe, is now owned by Walt Disney. Walt Disney is now locked in a very ugly fight, primarily, as I understand it, in the state of Florida, which is now governed by the latest sort of Trump clone, a man named Ron DeSantis, who is taking books out of libraries and telling teachers what they can and can't teach. And Disney, which has an enormous number of gay employees, there are a lot of gay people in show business, has been challenged by its own employee population to take a stand against some of the Neanderthal policies of the state of Florida, where they have an enormous money-making complex called, I think, Disney World. So getting them to, and they have, by the way, pushed back against Ron DeSantis, and Ron DeSantis has pushed back against them. For the day after, I think, continues to be a political hot potato, and for Disney to want to rebroadcast it on one of their central distribution places probably would involve them in a lot more pushback, which is one of the things that makes it slightly hard. On the other hand, as you pointed out, the film is widely available. What's different now is that there are so many venues for exhibition of movies, online, television. We are drowning in shows, many of them, by the way, quite good. But between Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and Apple and so forth, you can't keep up. And it used to be, we had what was called the water cooler conversation, where everybody had seen a certain episode of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and you could talk about it the next day at the office. Well, there are no more offices, and everybody isn't watching Mary Tyler Moore. They're watching a million different things. So the sort of unified bullseye impact that the day after was lucky enough to have. You know, it's some people ask me, do you believe in miracles? I go, no. That's why I'm always so astonished when they occur. So why did the day after happen? It happened because Brandon Stoddard of ABC Circle Films had a big hit with a television series called Roots. And he was looking for a follow-up to Roots. And he happened to see a movie called The China Syndrome with Michael Douglas and Jane Fonda and Jack Lemmon. And it was about a disaster at a nuclear power plant. And the week that the movie opened, there was a disaster at a nuclear power plant, 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. And these things kind of coalesced in Brandon Stoddard's head. And he came up with this idea. what would there be, what would it be like if we showed a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union? Never mind who started it. What would it be like? Not Washington, not politics, not military, but, you know, just people like us. And the answer is it would be very, very bad. And so they hired Ed Hume to write the screenplay of it. Meanwhile, corporate ABC was coming down on this man like a ton of bricks. And he, as I later learned watching the documentary, that he threatened to resign if the damn movie didn't get on the air. And meanwhile, he was fending off death threats on his life, all of which I had no idea about at the time. So you have to have another bizarre confluence of events. Sometimes people do the right things for the wrong reasons. And by the way, the reverse is also true. Sometimes people do the wrong things for the right reasons. And accidents happen, all kind of accidents, good and bad. In that sense, the day after was a kind of an accident. He was looking for another hit show. He didn't know he wasn't out to change Ronald Reagan's mind about a winnable nuclear war. He wasn't about to get Ronald Reagan to sign the intermediate range missile treaty with Gorbachev. He was just trying to make a buck.
My goodness, well, then my point, Brandon Stoddard, one person. And we all have groups, we all have places we can get this movie out. I'm not kidding. We can do this. So Tad, if you could quickly ask your question, Tad, go right ahead.
Thank you, Arthur and Melanie, so much for putting on this terrific event. I want to say hello to Daniel Ellsberg. Tad Daly's my name. I'm with Citizens for Global Solutions. Dan Ellsberg is on our advisory board and also my longtime friend and colleague and fellow RAND Corporation staffer. Nicholas, hello. We've met at science fiction conventions a couple of times. And I think you know my wife, Kitty Feldy, who was a longtime talk radio host here in Los Angeles.
Sure, you bet.
Good. Yeah, thanks for remembering Kitty. And Nicholas, I want to talk to you for just a minute about Star Trek, and then ask a very specific question. People often say, oh, isn't Star Trek wonderful because everybody gets along, you know, different races, different species. It's a positive vision of the future. And sometimes I think that misses one of the big points, which is that war has been abolished among these sentient species because they have come together politically and constitutionally in something called the United Federation of Planets. That was preceded in the Star Trek universe by a unified Earth. That's the political idea that Gene Roddenberry put forward. I know Arthur and Melanie were here when we, 3 years ago at Citizens for Global Solutions annual meeting, we had Rod Roddenberry come to speak to us, and it was really terrific. And I asked Rod, did your father ever think about extending it to the whole of the universe? So there are no Klingons, so there are no stand-ins for the Russians, a portrayal of all the people and even all sentient species unified into one political unit, and consequently, there is no war. So is that something that's ever occurred to you, Nicholas, to do a portrayal where there aren't any external enemies and truly war has been abolished through the universal political unification of humankind? And
I don't think my answer is going to make you very happy, but this is where my political ideas and my profession come into conflict, because drama is conflict. And if things don't go wrong, and if people don't get along, there's no story. So one can talk about utopias of greater or lesser size. You can talk about intergalactic utopias where everybody gets along, but it's hard to imagine a TV show or a movie in which, in effect, nothing happens.
Thank you. Good argument for not doing it in art, but not a good argument for not doing it in real life. Can we agree on that, maybe?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. But put me out of business, please.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
My input would be, you can make the conflict different where it's not the same war mentality and violence and that time. So there's conflict, but it's not the conflict we're used to. And there's where the filmmaker comes in, because to imagine something new and different, that's what helps us grow. And so when we have these filmmakers taking us to a different level because we can't do it ourselves, that's makes a huge difference in societies. So maybe going back to partnership systems where things were worked out, and looking at the chalice and the blade and how societies, there were partnership societies more prevalent. And so we could do that. Jean, go right ahead with your question. Jean, you're next.
Thank you. I just want to say that Nicholas and Daniel, you're the ultimate heroes. And I would like a question to both of you on if you might have a strategy for youth engagement, like a miracle youth engagement, like we had in the 60s of Ban the Bomb, and something so significant that the world couldn't turn away from. Also, I wanted to thank you for bringing up Face in the Crowd. It's one of my all-time favorite films. And hopefully there'll be a 40th anniversary of Day After. Hopefully we'll all be alive to see something like that. So if you have any comments, Top Gun Maverick made billions this year. Oliver Stone has been big with his Ukraine on Fire online. So I lay it out to you guys.
You had this extraordinary event of a movie being seen by 100 million people. And Nicholas has indicated that for technical reasons, in effect, that's extremely unlikely for any movie, again, today, a television movie. But you know, the effect came not from affecting 100 million people, which actually didn't in itself affect policy at all. It affected one mind, Ronald Reagan. And a guy that I've just seen a clip from he appears in this movie television event, but in a issue, a 4-part series about Ronald Reagan, this guy, Kenneth Edelman, who is I'm not a fan of Kenneth Edelman. He was actually appointed to dismantle the arms control and disarmament agency by being made its head, and in effect, take it apart. And yet he was saying later that in his eyes, Ronald Reagan was moved from being a hawk, a nuclear hawk, to a pacifist by seeing this movie. And we all know that he was depressed for at least the day, couldn't get out of bed. He says in his memoir, greatly depressed. Some have said it took him a couple of days really to get out of bed. And that didn't have an immediate effect. That was in 1983. We're coming up on the 40th anniversary of that. And nevertheless, despite Nick's hopes, he was reelected. That was a depressing event for me, let me tell you. When I said earlier that 87% of the public wanted a nuclear freeze, stop, no more on our side or the other side, you can't find 87% of the public who can tell you who the vice president is. That's just unknown. It's like unanimous. And they voted in a landslide the next year for Ronald Reagan. And I can tell you, I was clinically depressed after that. I thought, you know, what we hear about what the public wants is not the way they vote. This is very bad. And yet, in his second term, which Nick failed to prevent him from having, thanks in large part to that movie, he was able to talk about with Gorbachev the only time the two heads of state of any countries have discussed the actual elimination of nuclear weapons. And it was Graham and Edward Teller and others' influence on Reagan in favor of this fantasy, this hoax, if I may say, this Star Trek idea. I happen not to be a Trekkie fan, not because I don't like them, I just haven't seen them. But this fantasy of Star Wars as preventing, you know, any nuclear war, he could not go along with his own discussion with Gorbachev of eliminating nuclear weapons, because Gorbachev said to do that, we've got to maintain the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And Reagan wasn't willing to do that, so that didn't come about. I come back to the point that getting this to be seen, changing the reality, the fantasy reality of every president, which is it is acceptable to threaten nuclear war, and not only because it's the foundation of our foreign policy and our alliances, as it still is, and not only because it's extremely profitable, campaign donations, jobs, and everything, to build first strike weapons, which are as much of a hoax as anti-ballistic missiles and civil defense, but very profitable. What the movie showed was that whereas Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev agreed, nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. But there's a paradox that people don't understand. Why then are we preparing for it? Why are we rehearsing it? Why are we planning for it? Why are we keeping those ICBMs in their holes? And the answer is they didn't say what is true and what the movie says, the truth. It can't be limited either. And you can't limit damage. It is, as Sagan pointed out that night, nuclear winter makes it especially clear that even in the Southern Hemisphere, it doesn't matter who goes first or second. And the movie showing that ambiguity, that it's not a matter of some evil people on one side initiating this world-destroying thing. The problem is that people on both sides imagine that it is less bad, however bad it is, to go first than second. Why do those Minutemen in the movie streak up? And I agree with the others who said it's extremely startling to see those actual trails, more than one, actually go up at once from the United States. I've seen that twice, a Minuteman and an MX, in places where I'd spent the night trying to postpone that firing and got arrested for it. And failing, we actually did postpone it by hours, but having failed to stop it, watch those contrails go up into the sky. And the thing I've seen that. So the movie says, not only can it not be won, it can't serve any human purpose. It cannot limit damage. It cannot prevail in any sense. And that's the secret that the Pentagon doesn't want told. Has any president in the White House seen the day after since November 1983? Let me bet not. I'll bet not one president has ever seen it, because they don't act as if they had. And more than any book or any op-ed or anything else, I'm looking at Tad Daler here, who wrote a book, Apocalypse Never, like me, hoping that it would change minds. But our books didn't do that to an extreme degree. We're looking at somebody here who did do that, and did it, as they say, not just for, not only for 100,000 million people in America, but for a man in the White House. 200 million people in Russia. Gorbachev already knew about nuclear winter, actually, so he met Reagan on that. So the question, it's not a small, it would be miraculous to get this in the minds of Congress. But I don't want to wait for the 40th anniversary, November 2023, for the 40th anniversary of this film or some other film. Nuclear weapons may have gone off before that.
Well, they have gone off. They have. They've certainly been dropped. We've dropped nuclear weapons on North Carolina. They didn't go off. And just read about the monkey wrench incident in Arkansas, where we almost had it.
Excellent book by Eric Schlosser on that last incident with a Titan II missile. What hasn't been done, I think they even did a documentary on Schlosser's excellent book, Command and Control. But what it didn't show was what would have happened if the warhead, which was blown off by the accident into the brush, they couldn't find it for a long time, what would have followed if it had exploded? It was a 20 megaton warhead, 20 million tons of TNT, meaning more explosives than in all the wars of human history in one warhead. And you wouldn't have just a major flash, if that had gone off, your movie, and no movie has ever done this, would show what happens to the surrounding countryside, the end of the state, the end of the region, what the people would really, what would follow. As your movie shows, by the way, the lucky ones are at ground zero. They are vaporized. No anguish, no pain, no regrets, no nothing. What your movie uniquely shows, and there is a British movie that couldn't be shown on BBC called Threads. It's the only other movie that shows this. Very hard to get it, not impossible. But both of them show what happens afterwards. And the people from nuclear winter, it may take them a year or 2 or 3 for everyone in the world to starve. But starvation is not a good way to die. And radiation is not a good way to die. I think it was General Groves, one of the top people after Hiroshima, when the first word came out of radiation sickness, which people had never heard of before, which is shown in your movie. He actually said, I understand it's a rather pleasant way to die. Well, there are better and worse ways to die, and radiation is not one of the better ones. So I think that would get in the Joint Chiefs themselves. I'd like to see the Joint Chiefs even get the president to see it. The fact that they saw it was a historically significant event. And I refuse to believe now that that is more impossible than the other impossible things that have happened, like your movie getting shown and the Berlin Wall actually coming down, which was impossible. It was a miracle.
Nicholas, comment, or I have a comment. I have a comment.
You go for it.
Okay, well, okay. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for all that information, new information for a lot of people. And okay, now you're talking about getting it to the leaders. We are having next week, Don't Bank on the Bomb. We're going to have Susie Snyder. So I'm asking everyone here to come back. Also bring all your friends, everyone you know, because we want to convince ICANN, which is doing amazing work. There are already 66 countries that have actually ratified saying no to nuclear weapons. Actually, nuclear weapons are illegal right this second. And so anyone who possesses them is a criminal. And so let's get together next week. Let's convince ICANN to do screenings to all the countries, maybe at their next meeting, all the countries, get this movie out. And there's getting it to people in government, but that's not all. We have to get it to all the public. The public needs this. We're not going to stop till everyone gets a television event and the day after. So that's my comment. And now I'll go to our next question, which is Stefan, Jules, could you be quick? We're getting close to closing.
Yes, Stephen, I will be quick. Hi, Arthur. We go way back. Nicholas, I saw you on the Arkin Brothers podcast, and you've been kindly coordinating with Linda Carfagno. Thank you for doing that. And to the point, I was wondering, for one thing, well, let me just say in the chat that you probably haven't seen yet. Of course, Disney, all this stuff, that's sad about PBS. The viral can be film festival releases of the movie and online and sharing it with what I would say the importance of trying to not just preach to the choir and find a way to reach people that aren't aware of these things. I loved your comment, Mr. Meyer, about no public education. I am a product of the third oldest public school and the worst public school system in the country, Baltimore. I just went to our 30th reunion. I grew up with the Berrigans, by the way, and was wondering, those of you mentioned being arrested, whether you were involved with them. I grew up with their kids, rather, of course. And anyway, to a question, what I was going to say is maybe pick one if we're low on time, but when you mentioned if you did do a redo, that it would be on a global scale, who might be the threats of the dangers, and more particular to the 1983 movie, to the day after, which terrified me as a kid. What was the mood on set like?
Henry James said that life is hot, but art is cool. If you are the puppeteer, you cannot be out front sobbing at the performance. You must remain behind the stage, dry-eyed, and make sure that the strings do not become tangled. So for me, my job was to stay cool and do my job, and not to, the research was horrifying. The research was terrifying. The research was the worst part of it. Making the movie was a job. The actors had it worse. I sometimes think that actors after coal miners and firemen have the worst jobs. They are terrified. Their job is to go down into their soul in a bucket with a rope and come back up with stuff that the rest of us spend our time trying to avoid. Or if they go a little nuts in the process, you have to cut them some slack. I didn't go to that place because I was making sure that the strings didn't get tangled. And that's basically how I got through it. I should say somewhere along the way that one of the things I discovered making the movie was that I didn't want to make a good movie, because then people would talk about the movie and they wouldn't talk about the bomb. So if the acting was too good, if the cinematography was too good, if the music was too catchy, if there were anything that stood out, people would leap to that. Gee, didn't you love John Lithgow? Didn't you love Joe Beth Williams or Steve Guttenberg or Jason Robards or John? I didn't want any of that. I didn't want to give people an escape hatch. So there's very little music in the movie. I didn't want anybody, being goosed emotionally. So it was a sort of counterintuitive exercise, which was another reason to remain dry-eyed and make sure that the movie didn't become art by accident, because then we discussed the art.
Yeah, that was brilliant. That was brilliant.
It was my finest moment.
Quick.
Mr. Meyer, I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know if you heard my earlier comments before I asked the question, but I was saying that thank you for. I recently saw you on the Arkin brothers, and just like this, everything you say is like a masterclass in real old school filmmaking, and it warms my heart that you exist and that you're still sharing your knowledge and wisdom. And I mentioned that thank you for connecting. I suggested to Linda Carfagno, whose father you worked with, after seeing you on the Arkin brothers, that she reach out to you, and I understand that that's in the process. And so I just want to thank you for all the things, and I know we're out of time. So
I wish my mother were alive to hear you. Yes.
Quanta Dawn Light, you're next. Go right ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm sort of both mentally and emotionally nurtured by listening to you and being with you, all of you, because I believe that you are each spoonful of salt in a big container. Now we have to take this and make it available to everyone, but be so objective that we try to use a unifying language so that we can reach out to everybody, because we are all here like-minded people. So I'm thinking that we have to change even the language of peace and make it so that people can relate to it. Say, your freedom, your life, your tax dollars. Come and learn how it is at risk. So we create a program that is creating a document, which is a combination of Eisenhower's speech. We can take extractions out of it, and as well as the day after. I am 76 years old. So I am very concerned about the future generations, but we have to make the language unifying so that we can bring everybody to the table. And also, I think women and youth have to unite and make a demand that our government that spends anywhere from $1 to $1 trillion annually make 1% of that budget for peace education. Don't even call it peace education, because people seem to be allergic to the word peace unless you are a peacenik like I used to be. So we have to make it available to everybody so that they can relate to, what is this about? Oh, my life, my freedom, my tax dollars. They can relate to that. They can relate to the fact that their children's education, healthcare, and future depends on learning and teaching about how the government is stealing their resources and their children's resources and putting it in the military industrial complex. And I hope some young people can understand what I'm saying. I don't know who's here. So please make this available to everybody and find a unifying language. Thank you very much. I love all of you. You are dear to my heart. Thank you.
I want to keep this as real as possible. And I notice a couple of things. One is half this country is tuning out the other half entirely. It isn't merely a question of finding language that is, for lack of a better word, inclusive. It's getting people even to listen to the same station. Half the time, we can't even agree on what topic we're discussing. One half calls it murder. The other half calls it a woman's right to choose. There isn't even a place to meet. One half of the country listens to NPR. One half of the country, reads the newspaper. The other half is ingesting conspiracy theories and nonsense on the internet, which is the worst disaster. Even people of goodwill who think that if they hit $5 and hit send, that they're doing something, are not the same as when we were in the street. That's different. And the internet makes you think you don't have to go in the street. So we are sort of the victims of all sorts of technology. There's no longer things that are peer reviewed. Anybody, any jerk on the internet who espouses some nonsense, and it's always, by the way, in uncivilized terms. It's road rage put on computers. It's the trick is to find a way to get people to listen to each other. And in order to do that, you at least have to find a venue, a format, a safe place where people from both sides are willing to venture. And the problem is that, as I say, half this country just is dialing out what the other half is trying to say, for better or worse, on both sides. So listening is a real problem.
Yes, and I'd like to add, that's a great point, and I'd like to add, I think it's on purpose dividing us. That's just and
we have a phrase, divide and conquer.
Yeah, exactly, and that's easy, and then you can control the masses. So we just have to be knowledgeable about that. We also have to do something about it. Now let's go, gentlemen. How much longer? Are you still okay? We have 3 more questions, 4 more questions. You're good. Nicholas, you're good. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, quick. Todd, can you go fast?
A quick plug for this book, The Doomsday Machine by Dan Ellsberg. So a question related to it, and I'm a retired military officer, Army officer, and I know that in the first Gulf War, from firsthand experience, we would have used nuclear weapon if the war had gone against us. And that's still doctrine. Dan has talked about that. Dan talks about the Dr. Strangelove movie in this book, and he points out how when he first saw it, he thought that this is a documentary. And then in another chapter of the book, he talks about the war plan, where the US generals are ready to kill 300 million plus Chinese and Russians and everybody else in that area. So I guess my quick point to Dan, or comment on, I know the military, and I was on active duty during the time of this movie. The military totally hated this movie. I mean, the low-ranking people, the high-ranking people. And so how do we overcome the pedestal? We've now placed the military on such a pedestal over the last 20 years that we really believe they're the good guys, when in fact they'd still kill 300, 500 million people at a stroke of pushing a button. How do we convince the American people that our military leaders aren't the benevolent defenders of liberty in the world that we like to think that they are?
In terms of the leadership of this administration, in terms of foreign policy, and the Russian administration in terms of foreign policy, I'd have to say I'm not aware of any good guys on this. Biden, when he was campaigning, said that he would support and that he favored no first use, that there were no circumstances under which he would initiate nuclear war. He hasn't said a word about that any more than any other president ever did since he was president almost 2 years ago. No first use has gone. And now this would be a good time for him to say it in Europe, in the Ukraine case, because in contrast to the past, when we were overwhelmed conventionally in Europe, and we made the first use threats protecting Berlin and West Germany and others. Now the conventional balance has changed. The Warsaw Pact, as I said earlier, has shifted sides. Russia has much less weaker conventional forces in that area. And Russia is making the first use threats. Now, as Putin has been making, I just read last night in a British journal, they count Putin as making 4 nuclear threats during the last 6 months to Britain, which is being very hawkish, Britain. And the British leading candidate for prime minister, Liz Truss, was asked just a day or two ago on television, are you ready to order the Trident submarine to initiate nuclear war? She said, I am ready. And the person asking them, the interviewer said, gee, it would make me sick. How does it make you feel to have to think of, as in the way context he put it, ending most life on Earth? Not just a tactical use nuclear, but the Trident is, if the whole submarine went, it's the end. How does that make you feel? She said, it's a primary responsibility of the prime minister to make that decision, and I'm ready to do it. She repeated it twice. I'm ready to do it. Now, doing that would be insane. Now, let's took it, but she has to do it. That's a criterion for her being a serious candidate for prime minister, just as Theresa May earlier said the same thing. She was actually asked on her first day as a woman, prime minister there, would you be willing to kill with a nuclear weapon 100,000 people? She said, yes. Necessary for the prime minister. Now, 100,000 people is a different era altogether. We killed 100,000 people in one night of March 9th, 10th, 1945 in Tokyo without using nuclear weapons. A Trident submarine altogether, we're talking not just about 100 million, 10 million, 100 million. We're talking about nuclear winter getting started. That's 6 or 7 billion. So talking about we're ready to do it. Okay, when Putin is making these threats, the world should be able to say, that's outrageous. That's insane. Over Kiev, over Ukraine, you've got interests, yes. Are they interests that justify destroying, not all, but most life on Earth? Of course not. There is no such vital interest of any country in the world, but we're not hearing that. We're just saying, oh dear, this is worrisome. The threat is rising. It's like past crises and so forth, and not focusing on saying, you're making a threat of a totally insane, wicked, evil permission. There are no human words to describe what doing that would be, but we can't say it because on the one hand, it's our policy, even in NATO, where it's no longer remotely justified, legitimated even by a hoax. We can't say it because we rely on that threat in Taiwan, where they have conventional superiority. So just as we use it against, just to protect West Berlin, we're using it against Taiwan, which is again, threatened by China. Again, whatever you think about Taiwan and the democracy and everything with them, do the Taiwanese or anybody else have an interest in actually carrying out the initiation of nuclear war over that? When we talk about this film as presenting information that Reagan had not internalized and that nobody knew, foreign policy and Russia's is based on American ignorance. It requires American ignorance of what's in that movie. It requires denial of it. And we're very good at denial and very effective. It's very well achieved. What that movie, if I may end with this, the movie television event, which people may not realize is a title of a movie, which you can see. I strongly urge you to see it after seeing The Day After. And I suspect that, I won't press him on this, but I suspect that Nicholas has very mixed feelings about that movie, if not real resentment of it, because it raises the problem of conceptual notions fighting within the team at that time, where that movie, I'm sorry to say, presents mostly the other side, not Nicholas's side of that. And when he was losing at one point and separated from the project, he wasn't so cool. He says he was in bed and he was depressed, and very understandably so. I sympathize with him. The movie doesn't make that clear. But what is clear is that in the end and in the beginning, Randall Stoddard showed a kind of civic courage in the face of the obstructions and people saying this is impossible. And even people that differed with Nicholas did. And certainly Nicholas, from the beginning, I think he gave a false impression when he said we were all, or at least Stoddard, was just trying to make a buck. I don't think any of them in the end. I can't believe it. It wasn't the way to make a buck. They understood that very well. They didn't make very many bucks and they didn't have any chance to do it, but it was something they thought should go out. So the reason that I find, if you look only at The Day After, 40 years later, and realize that nothing has changed much permanently. There was a change initially on the intermediate range missiles. That's been canceled. The ICBMs that you saw go out the air, they're still on 10-minute alert. They could still preempt in this situation. That's outrageous. It's scandalous. It's terrible. But to see that it hasn't changed by anything, not The Day After or anything else, can only be depressing, I would say, by itself. But then when I saw the other movie with all its shortcomings about the internal disagreements, I saw there was civil courage, moral courage at a high institutional level that I never saw in Vietnam, and I never saw in Iraq, and I never saw, with all ABC's human limitations as an institution, they did something. They risked their careers, they risked their money, they risked their career in a way that not one official in the US government ever did in Vietnam or in Iraq or anywhere else. It showed me it's possible, it happened, and it did make a difference. So it ended me less depressed than I've been for a long time.
My headline response is a feeling that whether you're talking about presidents or presidents of networks or ordinary people or prime ministers, when they talk about this, nobody really understands what they're talking about or what they're saying. When somebody says, yes, I will push the button, they have no idea what they're saying. When I think it's fair to say that, you know, when Brandon Stoddard about nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, he had no idea what can of worms he was opening. He was looking for a follow-up to Roots. He was looking for a television event. He got a lot more than he bargained for. I agree that by the time he realized where he was, it took an enormous amount of courage, not only moral, but as it turned out, physical courage, if he was getting death threats, to press ahead with this movie, to threaten resignation. When people, in charge say that they will be willing to push the button, they have no idea what they're saying. They have no idea what they're talking about. It's political posturing to look strong. Right now, there is no strategic advantage that I can see to Vladimir Putin continuing this war. There is only ego and political advantage to him staying in power, rather than admitting that he fucked everything up and a lot of people have been killed for nothing. And by the way, if you go down into one of these missile silos, and I was in one, there's two guys down. These things, by the way, run on floppies. I don't know if anybody knows that. The whole missile system is running on floppy disks, and there's no way to update them. There's no way to update them. But there's two guys down there in 12-hour shifts or whatever they are, and they're sitting far apart from each other, and they've each got to turn a key to launch the missile. And if they don't both turn the keys, then assuming the damn floppies even work, the missile can't be launched. So what if one of them doesn't want to turn the key? Well, the other one, they both have guns. They both have sidearms. And presumably, one can train a sidearm on the recalcitrant other and say, turn the key. But if the guy doesn't want to turn the key, what are you going to do? Shoot him, but he can't reach both keys at the same time anyway. So it is I don't know if it's a Kafka-esque world or it's just a kind of Marx Brothers world where A, you don't know what you're talking about, B, the stuff doesn't work, and C, you can't, there's no way to kind of make it work unless everybody is willing to turn the key.
Wow, insane, scary, scary. Okay, deep breath, everyone. We're gonna go, we have 3 more people. Let's go really quickly. Peter, you're next.
Thank you, Melanie, and thanks for muting me while I was coughing. This has been a very stimulating event. I'll skip all the complimentary things I want to say to everybody. It stimulated me to come up with a proposal, and the proposal comes from the following knowledge. Joe Biden gave a very significant speech at the very end of his vice presidency on nuclear weapons. At the tail end of it, he said, and I'm quoting, "If we want a world without nuclear weapons, the US must lead the way." He didn't say should or could, must, he said. And then he went on to say, because we're the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons, we have a great moral responsibility to lead the charge. Those are his words. I think that's still what he believes, but he needs an impetus to do it. And he needs cover or whatever, okay? I don't think he's changed his mind. The man has a lot of integrity. So what I propose is that we use this movie or something like it to give him that impetus, to stage this movie and have him be prepared for what's going to come out of the movie, out of the showing, so that he can then say, okay, we can't have this. I'm going to start negotiations amongst the 9 nuclear nations to jointly eliminate their nuclear weapons. How do you get the people to watch it? I think Nicholas gave us the cue. The way people were so attracted to it was that there was there was great controversy about it. So we need to stir up a huge controversy. After all, what has gotten Donald Trump all of his attention? It's the controversies that he stirred up. It's the same thing that Nick mentioned, when you have to have drama to capture people's attention. So let's create a controversy about showing this movie, and then show it and have Joe Biden primed to take the lead. That's my proposal. Takes a lot of staging, but we got some really good people here. Nick, are you up for it?
Oh, I'm up every day.
Excellent.
Great. Okay. Well, that's call to action. First of all, we have two more, and that's it. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying so long. Bonnie, if you could be super quick, and then go to Tom. And
gentlemen, I was in the early 1980s, the original co-producer and director of Dial a Shuttle, that first international telephone broadcast that was going on. And what I am actually wanting to look at is today, that the Putin, trying to communicate with Putin. And the way I see at this stage to communicate with him would be to communicate with him from his direction, from his location, not from ours. And so I was wondering if you knew of any film writers or communication writers from, let's say, Russia itself, that is trying to perpetrate the same communication, but from them, that would be something that he might listen to rather than coming from us. Thank you.
A, he will listen, and B, I think anybody who tries will probably not live very long. It's the same thing with Donald Trump, by the way. These people are strikingly similar in their psychopathology. I'm not a shrink, but I've seen one on TV, and those guys are out of their minds. They do not listen. They cannot watch. It doesn't matter where it comes from. The only thing, sadly, that they do understand is force and power.
You know, may I say, I think Nicholas underplays a theme that he had very much in mind in the movie, in which came through. It didn't show a president. They mentioned a president. You heard one at one time sounding inane, like all the others. And yes, they don't know, in a sense, this movie, what meaning of nuclear war would be. But it doesn't take somebody unusual as a leader, or out of his mind, or unusually drunk, or in an altered state, to preside over this apparatus in a very dangerous way. Take 200 million people saw this in Russia. Could Putin allow this to be seen in Russia now by anyone? As his people know, in fact, they're doing it on television. People on television are making in Russia nuclear threats. Could they be doing that if if the people listening to them had seen this movie or knew what they were talking about? Nicholas says they don't know what they're talking about. That's true, but that doesn't make them safe. That doesn't mean they won't turn keys and they won't give the orders and whatnot. It's precisely easier to do that, almost necessary, not to know this stuff. And that's the reason why we don't see it. But Putin could not be making these threats now if his public was quite, say the people on television, were quite, this is what we're talking about. Nearly all Russians will die painfully over time if we carry this out. Hard to make those at the same time if you're doing it. So again, this notion of getting people willing, as the people in CBS in Nicholas were to put their careers on the line and to threaten to resign. Who threatened to resign over Vietnam? Let me tell you, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people inside that building at the Pentagon for Vietnam and years later for Iraq, who believed this was crazy, hopeless, needless, wrong. Not one risked their job the way that Stoddard did do. And I would say Nicholas did with his career. But that shows, so it shows it's rare, but it can be done.
Yes.
It can be done
Yes.
by others model. And that's what gives me more hope after the last 2 days of seeing all this.
Oh my gosh, yes, it can be done. And we have Tom, go ahead, super quick, super quick.
Oh, super quick, super quick. Okay, those of you that have come to the podcast over the years, I started with day one. I used to live on Arthur's estate in Mexico. First thing I want to say is thank you to Daniel and Nicholas. This has been what I believe to be the best podcast that Arthur and Melanie's done to date. I just want to say one thing as a question. How many people in their portfolio have military industrial complex stocks? Okay, if you do, I want to start something called divestment, blah, blah, blah. I even got Facebook stuff, pages, groups, divest yourself. You know, if we have seen a myriad of different subjects over the last almost 3 years, Melanie. I guess, it's like George Carlin, plant some trees, save the bees. This nuclear question is the most important one. The nuclear question is the most important one. And everybody talks about the problems and, people like ICANN, all these different groups are doing great things. This podcast, what Daniel and what Nicholas are doing and participating in this is great, which I need to respond to something that was said earlier. If it wasn't for the technology, we wouldn't be talking right now, period. So you have to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of the technology. This is the good part. So how about we start, at least nationally, some sort of program to get everybody, including every one of you that still have stocks in Martin Marietta or Northrop Grumman, Boeing, whatever, get rid of those stocks. And if you start a wave across the U.S., guess what? Maybe Martin Marietta will start making popcorn machines.
Yay, fantastic. My goodness. Great. Thank you, Tom. And Nicholas, Nicholas or Daniel, anything to add to that before I close?
I love popcorn.
Excellent segue, because we are going to have Don't Bank on the Bomb next week. Get your money. You are giving money. You could be very likely giving money to nuclear weapons, and find out if you are and do something about it. It's the simplest thing to do. Gentlemen, I can't thank you. Nicholas, Daniel, this has been incredible, phenomenal. Thank you so much for staying later. Out of this world, wonderful. So now I'm going to send it back to Arthur to close. Arthur, take it away.
Don't Bank on the Bomb is an incredible website. You can click on it. You can find out your bank, your financial institution, wherever your retirement program is, whatever it is. You can click on Don't Bank on the Bomb, and you can find out exactly who is involved in nuclear weapons production. There are also other links that stem off from that. The American Defense Service Committee also has a program where you can click on your stocks and find out who's involved in military adventures abroad and so on. Now, Susie Snyder not only coordinates Don't Bank on the Bomb, but she works with the Nobel Prize winner, ICANN. ICANN won the Nobel Prize for pulling together the coalition that has initiated this nuclear ban that has now been ratified into international law. And this ban not only calls on all the member states to not only not produce, manufacture, aid, abet, not in any way to assist, to transport, to do anything that assists assists nuclear weapons. And this treaty is actually, since it is international law, it's really up to each one of us to help enforce it. And one of the things we're doing in the People Powered Planet podcast is to figure out how we can do what the Star Trek did there in San Francisco. Back in San Francisco, that was the headquarters for United Earth. United Earth, imagine that. People got to see week after week in all these programs that there was a United Earth. In fact, there was a rule that a planet could not join the Federation unless it had an Earth, a way to govern that planet. How can you join a federation when you're different governing units all disagreeing with each other, fighting with each other? I mean, no wonder the planet's about to crash and burn. So you had to come together there with an United Earth government. And Gary's idea was that United Earth government no longer has to come from the top down, that it can be a bottom-up, people-powered planet. And he's got incredible ideas about how we do that. And that's what we focus on each week. And part of that people power, part of us taking responsibility for enforcing the existing nuclear ban that is binding, even though the nuclear states haven't signed it, it actually is binding on the world. It's international law. And one way we enforce that is by we're going to be signing up, having a thing here where you can sign up to say, I join in honoring and enforcing, and that I will abide by that treaty. And in so doing, I will join groups like Susie Snyder and not bank on the bomb. So come back next week to hear from her, from about ICANN, the incredible contribution they've made to help turning this around. She also is part of a book called A World Free from Nuclear Weapons, Sleepwalking to Armageddon, the Threat of Nuclear Annihilation, and War, the Environment, and the Environment Reader. So sleepwalking into Armageddon, that's what the world is doing. And Susie's going to talk to us about how to wake up from that nightmare. So let's hope we can all wake up from the nightmare. Again, thank you so much to our two Earth heroes. We have here two of the leading heroes of the planet. We have Daniel Ellsberg and Nicholas Meyer. I dare say without the two of them, we would not be here today. We would not be here on planet Earth. Thank you, guys. I kiss the ground you walk on. I celebrate. I wake up with joy that we are here. I wake up with joy that I can enjoy my grandkids and my dog and my cat and the walking on the beach. And I thank you for what you've done. Now it's all up to us. It starts with what one person can do. Each one of you made that one contribution with great courage. And now, folks, it's up to all of us. See you next week, and each week, every Wednesday at 10 on the People Powered Planet podcast. And before we close, one last word to Nicholas. How can they read your memoirs? How can they watch the television event? One extra word. How do people stay up with what we're talking about here today?
Well, you sort of took the question out of my mouth. Is this thing, this conversation, this colloquy, going to be available to people who press a button? And if you send me that information, I'll disseminate amongst my crowd that information. I would just like to say what a thrill it is to have my name mentioned in the same sentence with Daniel Ellsberg. Is like, I don't know, life is amazing. It was a great honor It's a great honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. And Dan, thank you so much. I don't know if you want to come on with a last word too. How can they get, well, the way they can get Nicholas's book, just go to Amazon and look up his View from the Bridge.
I have a website, believe it or not, and that's simplest. It's just nicholas-meyer.com.
There you'll get all the books, the movies, the whole shebang. Go to nicholas-meyer.com. And Dan, how do we come back and read your books?
Nicholas's book, View from the Bridge. I was reading it last night and I couldn't stop reading it. So for $9 or so, you can get the Kindle, and it is very worth reading and very, very enlightening to in some ways. I'll tell you how to do that. Or Doomsday Machine, you can get it used on Amazon. There's one thing that I haven't brought up. I want to tell Nicholas and everyone here, and I will bet that almost no one here knows the following major historical fact that I'm about to say, except I see Robert Gould here. He's extremely informed on these matters from Physicians for Social Responsibility. He probably knows, and that's this. If it weren't for one man, Petrov, a Russian colonel in September 26, 1983, September 26th. Now, the movie came out in November 1983. Petrov is watching, as in the movie, a warning that American missiles are on their way to Russia. And he is not sure that it's true. It might be a false alarm. Everybody in his command post, the kind of scenes you saw in the day after, is telling him it's an attack. It's an attack. Red lights are going off. Sirens are going off. People are saying it's an attack. He did not want to be the man who blew up the world mistakenly, and he wasn't sure, it wasn't happening. I actually had the chance to ask him later how sure he was. He said about 50-50. And he knew that if he had said 50-50, not 0, not 1, to his superiors, topped by Andropov at the time, they would have preempted rather than let their missiles be destroyed on the ground, use them or lose them. So he didn't tell the truth, 50% chance. He lied, and he was censured for it afterwards. He said, it's a false alarm, as it was. And then he waited for minutes to see, hoping he was right, and it didn't happen. And he said otherwise, had his subordinates prevailed on him to say what they thought was the case, mistakenly, the day after would not have aired. Very simply. November, no ABC, no, gone. It would have gone. We wouldn't be here. So that's what was happening when you got your movie out. And
I knew that about this guy who had to push the button. I didn't know the rest of it for sure.
There was, by the way, a movie about him called "The Man Who Saved the World." You can find it. I think it's a.
Someone just sent me a link to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see that. The point being, that's how close we were. And when people say we're now closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis, than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually that's wrong. 83, 40 years ago, the time the movie came out, we were actually as close as we've ever been. And it was one man away at that point. So and something like that happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. And why? Okay, here's something that there's 2 books on it which are worth reading. 1983 is the title of one. Another one, The Brink, something like that. You can find it, both good, on 1983. Nobody makes the following comment. The reason that Andropov was ready to go was he believed that Reagan was crazy and was planning a first strike. He believed it because Reagan was talking the way Trump talked, and that Reagan was building up first strike weapons like new ICBMs, as we are now. He was flying provocative flights into Soviet airspace, as is happening right now to some extent in the Taiwan area on both sides. He thought it was preparing a new strike. Okay, realistic, it was plausible. It wasn't right. Reagan did not plan that, but it was plausible. But why was he poised on the brink of firing his own weapons? Because of the crazy belief shared by our Air Force and presidents and Congress that if there was going to be a Reagan first strike, he's got to get it in first. And nobody has commented that his readiness, the danger of this, to send those weapons off, was based on now a totally unrealistic, crazy notion that under these circumstances, it'd be better for him to get his off first. And that's described in the day after. The people in the barbershop are discussing it. Launch on warning, use them or lose them. It's in the movie. And that discussion in the movie was going on in Russia at that time. As a matter of fact, the largest intelligence effort in the history of the world was being pursued by Andropov all over the world for indications that the US had launched, was about to launch its first strike. And okay, and why do that? So they're launching the first strike. What then? So we can launch ours first. Insane. We would have done exactly the same. When Zbigniew Brzezinski got the word at 3 in the morning in 1979, that Russian missiles were on the way, First he said 200 and more than that are on the way. He had his hand on the red telephone at his bed to call Carter and tell him what was happening. What was happening. His wife, Brzezinski's wife, was lying next to him in the bed. He didn't tell her. He's told the story. He didn't tell her because what's the use? Why wake her up like the Titanic? Let her sleep. And nobody has ever asked the question, why tell the president? What's the possible use? They're on the way, as is in the movie, 300 on the way. You see people reacting like that in the movie, what to do now. What's Carter going to do? Well, he said he would have recommended that Carter hit the Russian nuclear fields. That's what he would have said on the president. Just before, he had his hand on the phone, and before he said that, he gets a third call saying it's a false alarm, which it was. That's how close they came. But he said, I would send 200 missiles against the Russian missiles. To what effect, Big? How would that affect anyone in the world in terms of months or a year or two? Nearly everyone's going to die from starvation, radiation, everything. So this notion, this is why we still have ICBMs, supposed to restrict the damage, limit the damage. They are the reason that there is a 10-minute warning thing. Nothing else depends on getting it off the ground 10 minutes from warning. Get rid of the ICBMs, but it's not going to happen. Northrop Grumman has a contract for new ICBMs. There is no legitimation for that except for Northrop Grumman's profits, its campaign donations. Lockheed is a subcontractor. Boeing lost the contract. And all over the country. And the unions elsewhere that want it, and the president. Finally, why will Biden not say, we will not initiate nuclear war? By the way, believe it or not, just 2 days ago, the Russians seemed to draw back from their threats and say, we will not initiate nuclear war over the Ukraine. Very good. He said, that's only for existential threats to our territory. But they regard the Donetsk and Luhansk as being their territory. In fact, they want to annex it, which may happen September. Russian. They said any threat to our territory, including Ukraine, is an existential threat to us. So it's not as reassuring as it might be. But Biden will not call him on that and said, yes, yes, and we won't initiate nuclear war, because he would be charged with inviting a Chinese attack on Taiwan. And he won't do that. And the UN Non-Proliferation Treaty Renewal Conference is meeting this week. It ends Friday, tomorrow. They have a draft resolution, which the first time in their history of non-proliferation treaty, first time proposes no first use. We will not initiate nuclear war. It will be voted on tomorrow. Let me just say, in terms of miracles, here's what I think is impossible. Fortunately, I know that when I think something's impossible, it can happen. Like the movie got made, it all came down, Nelson Mandela became president. But here's what I think is impossible now. Impossible that draft resolution, first in history, will be accepted tomorrow. Impossible. Britain has already said we can't say that our policy is first use, right? Part of NATO. Biden will not do it. Others will not do it. Russia, it has, in my opinion, no chance. However, I'm getting through. But there is a public discussion of it now because of this resolution, because of the TPNW, much more than before. So seeing these movies, as I'm saying right now, makes me more interested in pressing this issue. Now, right now, when people are scared of nuclear war for the first time in many years because of Putin, they haven't yet gotten as scared as they will soon be over Taiwan. But they've gotten their attention now on this in a way that's rare since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And maybe in that context, it is right that people are making the effort on an effort that I regard as, in the short run, absolutely infeasible. But to say, even in Taiwan, you're inviting them in if we say we won't hit you, we won't blow the world up if you come in. We have to change our foreign policy, and all the world should tell us this. Our alliances and our insurances must not depend and be based on an assurance, a promise, a threat to blow up the world.
Thank you, Dan, for that very, very sobering reminder. And again, I do want to just say, it's actually, while the ecological threat to the planet is multifaceted and calls so many companies and people, the nuclear threat actually involves a very, very small number of companies making a profit on this. Now, they're not getting any counterbalance, so they're able to lobby Congress and throw money at it. But actually, they're a minuscule part of the total budget, of the total number of companies and people with interest in it. So do join us next week with Susie Schneider when we'll find out how we can pull that lever. There's a lever whereby publicizing, making very not at meetings of these corporations where they're having the stock meetings, not having protesters saying, no, we don't like this, having we the people go in and enforce world law and say what you are doing is illegal, it's a violation of world law, we are shutting you down, we're surrounding your board meeting, no board member gets to leave or come in until you stop this violation of international law. We have the power with a small number of companies to mobilize a movement that could act, and it doesn't take that many companies. You know, Honeywell, during the war of Vietnam, they stopped their bomblet production when there were protests and they were going to lose sales of thermostats, you know, and so they stopped it. A public movement has a lot more impact when it's focusing on a company. They don't want all this publicity, and we can do it. So come back next week for Susie Schneider. Do watch that amazing film, The Man Who Saved the World. Look it up. He is another one of the Earth heroes. He joins the two of you as a true Earth hero, has saved the world. Thank you so much. I love you both. Join us next week as we continue the next episode of the People Powered Planet podcast.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, you know we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.